Hello everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. So real quick, I just want to dedicate this episode, and basically anything wonderful I ever accomplish in my life, to my Grandma Jane. She passed away on April 4th, surrounded by all of us who love her. Without her, there would be no me. So Grandma, I love you. There are jobs that come with a lot more risk than others. For some, the risk itself being a huge part of the job. Firefighters running into inescapable burning buildings. Security guards having to engage with the deranged and dangerous. Truck drivers dealing with threatening weather conditions. And drivers. Those are some of the things that people in risky jobs may not want to encounter, but possibly expect to encounter. But what about ghosts? And what other career choices generate experiences deemed appropriate for the darkest hour? There's real-life horrors and unexplainable terrifying events. We explore them all here. So, let's get started, shall we? I'm an armed uniformed security officer in my city. Well, 2 years ago, my company was providing services for a motel named the Knight's Inn. The motel was preparing to shut down for a massive remodel, as well as code and structural updates. Now, the motel was previously 2 separate motels, but when the Knight's Inn bought it, they merged the 2 properties into one. During the nearly 20 years of running between both of the original motels, they saw some rather negative events. This location just so happens to be within walking distance from the county jail. So when a number of persons were released from custody, they found their way to these motels over the years. Murders, drug overdoses, and suicides were all reported on this property. All these dark events left negative imprints on these grounds. Fast forward to when I worked on the property during the overnight hours, and the 3 events during 3 separate shifts I worked, and the one I responded to as a cover officer. The first was on my 4th shift. The first few went very slow and boring. No one had told me or my staff the history of the property at this point. Well, the second to last week of operation, I was helping the on-duty night auditor prepare the morning breakfast bar. And the kitchen was in a part of the building where a long shut-down restaurant once was. The auditor was preparing waffle batter and filling pitchers of orange juice when an unopened 12-pack of canned soda exploded next to the service access stairwell, which was padlocked from the inside of the service hallway to the kitchen. The auditor's scream was chilling as well as deafening. Well, due to some of the less than upstanding guests they'd rent rooms to, I began down the stairs to find that the doors were still secured and no one could have entered through them. I stuck my finger in the puddle of soda, thinking that maybe it had been overheated or something, causing them to burst, but no, it was slightly cool. As I looked at the auditor, still shaking, holding a small kitchen knife, trying to calm her down, we both heard a loud little girl giggle. But it sounded unusual. Needless to say, we both bolted from the kitchen back to the main desk. 5 minutes later, the auditor told me no one checked in tonight with kids. The following week, and the last week of the location being open before the remodel, I was doing standard grounds patrolling, making sure no doors were unsecured or people fighting. Just about the time I finished, I get a call from the front desk calling a Code 6 priority. I ran back to the office, nearly tripping on the stairs in the courtyard. Once I arrived, I saw a young woman and her daughter, just the cutest little 3-year-old. The mother was crying uncontrollably, but managed to tell me her husband was not himself. That after nearly an hour in their room, he pulled a knife out of nowhere and started wildly swinging it in the room at his wife and kid. The wife said that he hates weapons, and he wouldn't have had one. So I began searching the grounds for the man, and I found him sitting in a dark corner of the courtyard. He had the knife in his hand and was blankly staring ahead. Once the knife hit the light, I saw the blood. Then I noticed he was bleeding. I ordered that he drop the knife as he slowly started to walk towards me. I repeated a second time. Then, on the third order, I drew my weapon and I ordered that he stop and to think about his kid. Right as I did, 3 local officers sprang from behind me, 2 with their CEWs, tasers, drawn. In a quick display, I heard the deputy order and then followed. Taser, taser, taser. The local officers took the man into custody, and they were having me fill out a statement when I overheard 2 of the deputies talking. Want to know what's odd? The room that they're staying in had a suspicious death a few days ago, but detectives say it was drug-induced suicide. The other deputy replied, What are the odds that this guy went nuts? I personally think that's a little too odd that a man commits suicide. Come to find out, he'd cut his arms until he bled out. And then a week later, another man loses his mind, cuts himself up, and is unresponsive the whole time he's being spoken to. Okay, so the most damning paranormal event, in my opinion, that happened was the first week we closed for remodeling. I was walking around the inside and another officer stopped in to hang out on his break. I made the suggestion that we sit in the old restaurant and see if the place was for real haunted. He reluctantly agreed. Using a spirit box app on my phone that before that night I thought I overpaid for, we sat and asked questions. For about 20 minutes, nothing came through, and we joked that maybe the place wasn't haunted after all. I thought I saw something across the room, so I tried to light it up, but I came to find out that my flashlight had died. So while sitting at the table, I pulled my taser out of the holster as we sat in a nearly pitch-black room to use its light if needed. Instantly, the Spirit Box app said, "Yellow, gun," in the same voice. Now mind you that me and this officer had the same level of training and were fully certified through the city. But his response was, "The fuck does it mean by yellow gun?" I then proceeded to place my taser on the table and turned its light on. I'd never heard so many F-bombs as I did from him as he stormed out of the room. The final incident, I'm still unsure of, but the one phrase the suspect yelled, "There will be more ghosts here tonight if you enter." 4 weeks after the motel closed, I was working a city patrol when an on-duty officer called for priority backup from all available officers on duty. "Sam, 262 to Nights Inn. What's the situation?" The officer responded.
4 to 6 persons have made entry into the back building, barricaded themselves into a room.
I was the first responding officer just after 3 a.m., and I met the on-duty site officer. As we were talking, and a third officer arrived, we heard 3 gunshots ring out from down the hallway. At this time, we contacted the local sheriff's office about the situation. Within minutes, several deputies arrived in ASV, active shooter vests, and helmets. They attempted to reach the room as we watched from the end of the hallway. 5 more shots rang out from the doorway. and luckily, no one was struck. The deputies fell back to the end of the hallway where the three of us were. A supervisor for the deputies ordered 4 of them to watch the hallway as the rest took position around the building. We asked what we needed to do, and he replied to block the entrances to the property and that no one comes in that isn't an officer. So basically, we were to keep out the impending reporters. SWAT arrived and the deputies pulled back. SWAT took position. The whole time, the suspects saw the activity from the windows and the holes in the door. A lieutenant with SWAT and a public relations officer came over to me and the other guys on my staff. And while asking us what happened before the deputies responded, and from a broken-out window, we heard the suspects say, "There will be more ghosts here tonight if you enter." Around 5 a.m., the SWAT armored vehicle pulled up next to the back of the building, and we heard 3 thumps. SWAT shot OC shells into the room before breaching from the windows and doorway. And just as soon as we heard the thumps and saw the smoke, 5 of the suspects were being carried out, and a 6th was being rushed onto a straightboard to an ambulance. Come to find out, the man with a pistol in the room took his 5 friends hostage and attempted to kill himself when SWAT breached. He later died at the hospital. So I wonder if he joined the other ghosts at the motel. After that night, we no longer provided security at the Knight's Inn. 8 months later, it reopened as some new age hipster hotel. I haven't been to that property for some time now, even though I pass it whenever I work South City Patrol. I wonder how the property is, and if the paranormal activity still happens, even after the remodel. This was back in 2015. I think the beginning of spring. It was my first job as a truck driver. I'd just gotten my CDL that January. But I was headed west on I-40 in North Carolina. I can't remember where I was headed exactly, but it was about 2 or 3 a.m., and there wasn't a car or truck anywhere on the road, which was a little odd. You always have some sort of truck traveling like I was because of team trucks with 2 drivers. But I was tired, which could be why what happened. I was still awake, though, as I'd just downed a 5-hour energy and a mean bean monster. When I get to the exit to Mabin, which is only a Petro truck stop, but this one's like a small town inside, I approach the exit, not slowing to a stop, and I see what looks like a woman walking from the oncoming side to the exit, but she was moving way too fast, and I was too close to stop for her. There was no way I could move to avoid her, and it looked like I ran over top of her. I stopped the truck, slinging my teammate from the bunk to the floor, him cussing. I'm jumping out in the middle of the interstate, thinking I just killed a woman. I walked to the front of the truck. Nothing. No blood, not even a dent. So I walk all the way around 3 times, and I look under the truck, but nothing. I don't know if I was seeing things because I was tired or if it was a ghost, but I know I can tell you what she was wearing. It looked like a white t-shirt with jeans. I don't remember seeing her shoes. Needless to say, I was awake the rest of the night. So a couple of weeks ago, I was working on the electrical wiring at a church, and I got into a pretty crazy conversation with the pastor there. It seemed pretty far-fetched, but as I listened to him, he never smiled. And he's also an older man. I'd assume he'd have no reason to tell such a lie in such detail? You tell me. So he tells me that like 30 years ago, he and some members of the church went to volunteer and spread the word of God to the villages of the African Congo. It was nearly a 2-month trip, and the gist of what they would bring was a lot of Bibles, English Bibles. There was about 30 people, 15 adults, 15 young adults, and they would ship supplies to build small structures. Their mission was to provide education, which the pastor clarified was teaching prayer, not math and reading. Besides helping out in the community, their main goal was to build a church so that all the people in the village could continue to worship, even once the church or the mission was ready to return home. So the pastor says one day he went with a couple of military-type guides into the rainforest to gather resources. The pastor tells me that the rainforest alone was an impending spectacle. Behind the tree line hides an unforgiving place. And he said, where even God can't find you underneath the foliage and the vines. Through what he described as sweltering and humid air by midday, they'd all just traveled 1 to 2 miles deep into the Congo. Still, they were areas only touched by villagers on rare excursions. The pastor also emphasizes how odd the younger guide was acting the whole time, how he'd been giving him an uneasy feeling from the start of their trip, continuously looking over his shoulder, speaking quietly to the other guide in their native tongue. The pastor says he even asks if there was something wrong with this kid. The guide leading the way tells him that he's very superstitious, and he thinks that this area of the rainforest is cursed. It's not. Don't worry about him. So they continue deeper. Eventually they make it to a water source and take a break. They all set their backpacks down or whatever they were carrying and drink and eat food that they packed. The younger guide is looking more and more uncomfortable while whispering to the second guide. The pastor asks, "What's he saying?" The guide does his best to translate his buddy's concern, but basically saying he doesn't want to be hiking back in the dark. Guide number 1 reassures both the younger guide and the confused pastor that they should be out by sunset. "Don't worry," he tells the pastor. The pastor tells me that he takes this opportunity to remind them that God is on their side, protecting them. Guide number 1 translates that back, and they all prayed together. Moments after, he says that the rainforest went silent. So noticeably quiet that even with the language barrier, an exchange of glances confirmed they were all feeling the same unsettling knot form in their stomachs. The ground starts to vibrate beneath them and then stops. The lead guide explains that they're above a winding cave system called the Teesville Caves. One of the tunnels may have collapsed, and that was probably the cause of the sudden quake. I ask the pastor what he's feeling when he's hearing this. Did he know there was going to be random earthquakes? He explains that he was truly freaked out, and at that point was firmly gripping the cross around his neck. He suggested to the group that they wrap up what they're doing and start the trek back. The guide says that they need to collect a fishing trapper net that they had a little ways up the river. They can't leave it out. So, reluctantly, they proceed to follow the river up about a mile until they reach the mouth of a huge cave, dark and deep. Its entrance swallowed any light that the trees didn't block. The pastor tells me that from a distance, it looked like huge patches of webs were stuck on the walls and rocks, resembling what some caterpillars do in trees in the summer. He says that that kind of stuff was all over the mouth of this cave, approaching. The pastor makes it clear he wants nothing to do with this, telling them, "I'm not going in there." But the guide tells him that's fine, that he can wait at the edge. It's only a couple of meters inside. The two guides get out their lanterns and leave their backpacks with the pastor. He watches them walk through this massive entrance. A couple of strides in, and the lead guide misses his footing on a wet rock, crashing into the shallow riverbed, destroying his lantern. The shattering of glass can be heard over the moving water. The younger guard scrambles to help him back up, but is told to stop moving. Or at least that's what the pastor thinks is said, because the kid freezes in place like a statue, both of them now staring into the darkness. The pastor held his breath. Fear hung in the air. It was an immediate saturation of senses, watching them both stay there motionless, doing their best not to disturb a single atom around them. This goes on until the younger guide slowly starts moving his lantern, briefly illuminating a small portion of the black with faint visibility. On the wall, there looks to be a massive cocoon attached to one of its interior formations. But upon closer inspection, as the light continues its path across, it's revealed to be a big leopard, deceased and wound tightly in the web. Its head is partially sticking out of the shell of silk around it. The pastor realizes that the shoreline and riverbed are littered with bones from many different animals, the sight of which makes him want to run, but he has absolutely no clue where. He says that while keeping his eyes on the light, scanning the cave, he slowly made his way out of the water with the others' backpacks and set them down on dry land. Just in case he had to move quickly, he didn't want to drop everything in the running river. The lead guide gets to his feet and points for his partner to shine the light up. When they do, the pastor says he witnessed a creature that, I quote, was a nightmare from hell, staring down at them. It was a spider, larger than a car. Only its upper half was uncovered. The rest of its body was tucked inside a hole above that it quickly retreated in when the light touched its eyes. The pastor stretched his arm out wide, said its legs were literally 5-6 feet long, something he couldn't help but catch his breath while describing to me. And it was fast, he said. Right when the light touched it, it pushed itself backwards into the labyrinth of tunnel formations. The pastor says he begins to shout at the two guides in the water, telling them to run. The shout makes them jump, sending them into a sprint directly backwards. They reach the pastor. Everyone throws on their backpacks, and now he joins in their sprint. Glancing back, the spider never reemerged from the nest to pursue, but that didn't change their pace at all. By the time they were out of the rainforest, the pastor's legs were covered in cuts and lashes from the vines and branches they ran through. He lifted up his pant leg and pulled down his sock to show me his old wrinkled scars on his shins, just to prove it. He says they got back in their truck, and well before sunset, they drove back to the village. En route, the lead guide is talking on the radio with some haste. When they arrive, they're at the village center, and the truck doors are being swung open by more military men. These ones have guns, and they look more official than the two guides the pastor was hiking with. They direct them out of the truck, bring them to a small wooden one-room building. Inside the building is a well-dressed man. He says he's sitting behind a table, smoking. When they enter, he puts out the cigarette and he stands up to greet them. The pastor says that this man's attention was mainly focused on him, and he spoke fluently in English, telling the pastor that what he saw will never reach Western media. He tells him that they have copies of his passport, his address, and other personal information that will ensure his compliance, otherwise risking total financial and physical ruin. He goes on, stating further that if word got out about this species of spiders, the deforestation to hunt and eradicate them would cause irreparable damage to all of the other wildlife there. He explains that when new nests are discovered in the caves, a team later sets out to bomb that tunnel system, closing off the entrance and destroying countless limited resources in the process. He tells the pastor, "You cannot stay here. You cannot speak of what you saw to your team. Your mission is over." And with that, they had other men pack up the pastor's belongings, and he was thrown on a plane back home, separated with no chance to talk to anyone from the church before he left. I asked him, what the heck did he tell everyone when they started wondering where he'd gone? He tells me he'd simply told them it was something God had told him to do. He says that he was most worried about them while they were still there. He wasn't sure that they would remain safe, telling me that the man that sent him home, he wasn't friendly, and he meant business. The pastor believed that he let them leave because of their affiliation with the church, and that's all. He ended his story to me with the name of the spider, or what he thought it was, not one that was shared with him by anyone in the Congo, but something he discovered years later when curiosity got the better of him. Of course, I can't remember the name of the spider, because it was something insane. But I've been searching the internet, and the things I'm finding, well, they're terrifying. The stories themselves, without visuals, they're enough to give me nightmares. It was too wild of a story to not share it with someone before it left my brain or something. So, what do you think? This happened last year, 2021, so I remember it pretty well as it still haunts me to think about. I was coming up I-77 in West Virginia, and the weather had changed from the rain and sleet to snow and whiteouts. I was at one of the spots that us truckers pull off at. I was trying to go ahead when I felt a heavy hand grab my shoulder, and then a man kind of chuckled and said,
"Son, if you're trying to drive through, then it must be important."
I said, "Yeah, I'm going home to see my kids." He gave me a look of understanding. He said he was heading home to see his grandkids, but he was going north to I-79. I was headed north to I-64, where I-64 and I-77 split, so I-64 goes west to Kentucky. We stood there and talked about things, and he said his name was Bill, and he was going to go on. If I wanted to, I'd be safer to follow him, because he could tell I was going to go on anyway. We get in our trucks and head out. We get out about 5 or 10 miles, and the interstate starts with the mountain drops. And as we do, I see his trailer going toward the guardrail, and I'm done. Almost to a complete stop because we can only do 45 here. And I see his truck and trailer break through the guardrail, with his trailer stuck in this position. I stopped, got out. I'm going to get my chains and whatever else I had to pull him up, when I see a DOT officer pull up. Where Bill and I had just met was the scale house, checking out the weather, so DOT was close. They stopped me, said that it would only pull my truck down with him. I fought back, trying to hook it up, but it was no use. I knew he was right. So I stood there, helpless. They told me that the tops of the trees had gone into the cab, killing him. And I remember thinking, why a driver with 25 years? Why not a driver like me with only 7 years? When I could have easily went off behind him. I've been past there a couple of times since, and my hands shake when I go by or when I think of that night. I think of Bill from time to time, and if not for him, I might not be alive today. So to Bill, thank you, and I'm sorry you couldn't make it home. To Bill's family, he was a good man. I'm sorry I couldn't do more to help him. I know it's not a ghost story, but not all haunts are ghosts. Some are just memories of stuff that we went through. I can't say that I've ever seen a ghost. The two experiences tell me I might have been near one. The first one, I was on recruiting duty in New Jersey for the Army. My wife and I lived on Fort Dix. FYI, it was the early 2000s, and while Fort Dix is not an active duty post anymore, the housing area and facilities are still used for personnel that have to work in the area. Or they were. I have no idea of their status now. The thing is, the housing area was supposed to be torn down and new houses built. They had actually torn down a section and they were going to build new houses. Then me and other service members would move from our homes to the new ones, and the houses we left would be torn down and replaced. That didn't happen because this was shortly after 9/11. All of these houses were the same, as you'd expect on a military post. Same layout, same basic stuff. We lived right next to a guy I worked with. Hell, 2 other guys I worked with lived on the same street. We all got along, but as you can imagine, even though I liked these guys, seeing them 12 plus hours at work and then after work, on days off, got old fast. Then, there was a hurricane that passed through. Fort Dix is relatively close to the coast, so there was a lot of rain. And since the Army has taken money out of maintaining the housing areas so they could build a fence around the entire post, the roof of our house collapsed. I'll spare you the details. Basically, we had to move. The government was at fault, blah, blah, blah. There were 2 houses that were available at the time. Yeah, I could have taken the option to move off post, but recruiting duty was brutal. I was at work all of the time, and my wife was already pissed about that. I was never home, and I only had Sundays off, and sometimes not even that. Plus, I knew it would end, so not looking for a lease off post when all I wanted was to get out of recruiting in New Jersey anyway. One house was available, right next to another guy I worked with. No problem. I liked the guy. He was cool and he wanted out of recruiting duty when his time was up too. The other was a block away. We looked at the first one. An older lady that worked with my wife had told her that she actually lived in the house on the post before her husband passed. She told her that even when they lived there, the house was creepy. It had a bad spirit in it. Me, whatever. Each house was the same. I felt that until we inspected it. My wife is not someone that gives in to superstition easily, but as soon as we entered the place, it felt off. I don't even know how to describe it. It was like nothing was level. Everything in our perception was off, like a fun house. Plus, I seriously had feelings of anger and rage with no provocation when we were in the place. I remember that because it was out of the blue. I was cool when we walked up to the place, but once inside, I instantly hated everyone. And I felt like I was 2 seconds from going berserk. My wife also felt uncomfortable in the place. It made her feel angry for no reason. We both decided, nope. We opted to move into the second choice. It was next door to the other guy I said I worked with, but what the fuck. I liked this guy, and his toddler daughter was a sweet kid, so no harm. We never found out why that house made us feel that way, but my wife will not deny that it wasn't us. There was something there. And she's not the person that will believe in ghosts and goblins easily. The lady she worked with wouldn't give details either, and she clearly didn't want to talk about it beyond what she'd already told my wife. I still wonder, what was it? When I was 17, senior class of 97, I stayed with a family in Western Ireland as part of my church's program abroad. I lived there for 6 months. The family's home was a cottage-style home, very old but comfortable and loving. Those were my thoughts as we pulled up to the front anyway, and I would maintain those thoughts for most of the house. But when I walked into my room, after I'd spent time there, I started to feel something heavier, something silent but consuming. At first, I kept telling myself, new places, new faces. It's all just new, and that's why you feel this way. But regardless of what I told myself, there was no way to stop the feeling I had in my gut. And the feeling didn't just stay there. It grew. Nightmares, almost every night. I never so much as remembered a dream, let alone suffered from nightmares. But I'd wake up with my covers being off of my body, off of my bed entirely. Sometimes, I swear I'd wake up just as it was happening. And when I did, there was almost always a cold chill in the air, even through the summer months. I asked the boy who was living there, the son, who I'll call Eric, had anyone ever complained about the draft that seemed to come from nowhere in that room, the one where I stayed. Eric was a little younger than me. He told me there was probably something wrong with the window. But Eric didn't look comfortable saying this. In fact, Eric tried to avoid eye contact. And contact in general. He really wanted to avoid my inquiries. So the nightmares. They almost always involved me trying to find the source of this icy cold breeze, with me walking aimlessly around this one room, my room. The chill would almost start to burn my skin. You aren't supposed to feel pain in your dreams, right? Well, I did. So were these actually nightmares or something else? I still don't know. Eventually, the nightmares got to a point where I couldn't hardly move. I'd be bound to my bed, stuck looking around the room from the horizontal viewpoint. By this time, it wasn't the nightmares or the blankets that scared me. It was waking up in pain. It left me feeling out of control, terrified. I'd have visible marks on my skin, not scratches, but rather patches of irritated skin, small rashes that burned, and my stomach would ache, a horrible pain, like it was eating itself. Again, I approached the son living in the home, just 2 rooms down from my own room. I asked Eric, or I told him rather, there's something seriously wrong with that room. Showing him my rash, I start to explain the nightmares. He's visibly uncomfortable, but he starts to talk. He's calling for his mother, Nancy. Now, my mom was in her late 50s at the time, so older than Nancy, who was in her late 40s. My mom was rather strict, deeply religious, and highly skeptical about pretty much everything. I respected my mother, but I didn't exactly listen or feel when she spoke to me about many things. I didn't feel she'd taken the time to really educate herself or open her mind. I know now she had little opportunity, but either way, I liked Nancy. I just wasn't sure how she'd respond to me asking about nightmares and such in her home. I was nervous. Though younger than my own mother, Nancy spoke with conviction. She spoke like she'd lived 1,000 lives, but she also felt really open, if that resonates with anyone. She filled me in on all the local history as we walked through town and the church over the last few months. We spoke of the Great Freeze and the potato famine suffered by the area a long time ago, the rebuild. She'd even taught me a very mild Irish reel, which I wasn't half bad at. I found it most interesting that she was a member of their version of a historical society. I asked Nancy about ghosts before, just a general question. Had she ever seen one? Would I see one? She laughed and told me to consider myself lucky if I see one on my trip, that she hadn't seen one in years. I sort of took this to mean my question was silly, that there wasn't such thing as ghosts in Ireland or something. Turns out I was wrong. Eric tells Nancy,
Corinne says that there's something wrong with her room. She's even got proof.
He shifts his gaze to me and nods, saying,
Show her your arms.
My sleeves are still up, so I shift my arms over to Nancy's view. She doesn't look surprised. Ah, I see. Long pause as she examines my arms. How have you been sleeping? Not great. I've been having nightmares for months, but now it's like I can't move. That's what I was telling Eric just now. They look at each other. For some reason, this spirit seems to communicate with the girls. She was a young girl. We believe her name is Emma. Nancy explains that the house has been in her family since the early 1900s. But prior to that, it was owned by the same family for many decades, and one just before that. The house had survived the famine, but the original family did not. It was typical for families to huddle in the highest room of the house, or for the last surviving members to stay in that type of room. Usually, it was children, and they didn't always make it. I understood this. There were several deaths during this time. It's why I was sure that the area was inherently haunted. Why do you think her name is Emma? Have you spoken to her? I asked Nancy.
My sister did.
Eric piped up.
That was her old room.
Then Nancy starts. Yes, she used a Ouija board, which she didn't have permission to do, by the way, and she says the girl is Emma, and that she died here in the house, in that room. She died hungry and freezing.
Your rashes are probably early stages of frostbite,
Eric said, rather eerily. There was a little bit of silence after his statement. I was feeling a bit better, actually. Not about his odd statement, but just in that I had experienced something that someone else had too. Did your daughter get these rashes too? They both confirmed that yes, she did. Well, how did she get it to stop?
She moved out,
they said in unison. Attempting to break the slight tension in the room, Nancy tells me, You're welcome to sleep on the sofa. It's not very comfortable, but given the state of your arms, it may suit you better. At the point of this conversation, I had just 1 month left in my 6-month stint. I opted to sleep on the couch, but I kept my things in the room. Every time I entered the room, I would say hello to Emma, or goodbye. Once I started sleeping on the couch, my sleep was back to normal. So much so that I seriously recommended they offer the couch first to any future guests. They explained to me they don't get many guests anymore. Apparently, word has gotten around about their home, their guest room already being occupied, if you will. I guess my parents missed that memo. They weren't even willing to entertain that what I'd experienced was real. Not that I was expecting much. They weren't the open-minded type, after all. I'll end by saying that when I left for good, I tried to give a pep talk of sorts to Emma. I won't share it here because it's between me and her, but I think she was struggling to move on or be heard. When I went to see the family last, on what would have been the 10-year anniversary of me living with them, 2007, I met the sister. She, Eric, and I walked through the old guest room, which was converted into a sort of sewing room for Nancy. The sister looks at me and asks if I can feel a difference. I stand there for a minute, and I take it seriously, sort of closing my eyes, relaxing, breathing. I don't feel anything except sunshine through the window. I look over at her, and I ask if she can feel it too. It's lighter, both literally, but in our lungs too. It made us both smile. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of the Darkest Hour. But don't miss a brand new episode every Friday night. I want to thank those who shared their stories, and a big thanks to all of you for listening. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Darkest Hour if you haven't already, and tap the notification bell so you don't miss a thing. Huge shout out to all of my patrons for their unwavering support. And a big welcome to our newest super official patron, Zoe Watt. Remember, if you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, you can join the Patreon too. Patreon.com/thedarkesthour. Follow me and keep up with all things Darkest Hour over on my Instagram at thedarkesthouryt. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.